Hi, it's time to return to the Miss Hickory and see what her adventures are. This is the book by Carolyn Sherwin Bailey. It was a Newbery Award winner back in the 1940s. We're on chapter 8, Wild Heifer's Supper Party. Crack, crack, Chatterjee. Silence. Crack, crack. Miss Hickory wrinkled her small nut face. Only too well did she know the meaning of those sounds. Down in his hole at the foot of her tree, Squirrel was cracking and eating the nuts that he had harvested at such thought and urging on her part. Now in December, with snow on the ground and often a light crust on top of the snow, it was high time to think seriously about food for the winter. Miss Hickory had not completely lost her fear of Squirrel. When they met in the orchard, Squirrel had an uncomfortable way of looking hard, without speaking, at her head. In playful moods, he still tried to pull off her winter hat. In fact, he had taken off and eaten the trimming. But on one of the first stormy nights of the winter, when snow fell and their tree rocked with the wind, when Miss Hickory had thought that the snow was an enemy instead of a blanket, Squirrel had come up mouse. As Miss Hickory pulled her leaf covers up to her chin, shivering more from fear than cold, she had seen two little gray paws clutching at the edge of her nest, two bright eyes peeping at her. She had sat up in bed. There's a picture of Squirrel there. "And what do you want this time of night?" she demanded. "Only to keep you from worrying," Miss Hickory, Squirrel had said. He had come farther and squeezed in beside her, all but his bushy tail that hung outside the nest. "Only to try and keep you warm." Squirrel had patted Miss Hickory's cheek with one paw. "Very kind of you, very kind, I must say," she had retorted bitterly. "Would you like my bed for the night and let me sleep in your hole? I dare say it's more weather-tight than this nest." "Oh, no, thank you so much." Squirrel had scampered down the tree to his cozy hole that was carpeted with old moss and had a pile of nuts in one corner. "No harm meant," he chattered on his way down. As she remembered that night, Miss Hickory asked herself if she had been fair to Squirrel. His poor memory, his inability to make a plan were unfortunate. Yet he had not seemed covetous of her head, only amused at it. So on this day of early winter, Miss Hickory jumped and swung herself down the tree, down boughs, and stood quite a while at the entrance to Squirrel's hole, only watching. Presently, as Squirrel cracked and ate another nut, she spoke. "How about tomorrow, young lad?" she asked. Squirrel jumped. He thought hard, trying to find an excuse. "Then I'll start right out today, gathering more beech nuts," he chattered. "And then what? Can you remember where your hole is? Can you keep from eating your nuts on the way home? If you do replenish your pantry, will you hold to 3 meals a day instead of 6? Now, Miss Hickory," Squirrel's bright eyes took on a canny glint, "it is easy for you to keep your nut." Miss Hickory did not wait. She was off and away as fast as her skates would take her. They had been shoes made of strong bark last summer, but rough going and climbing up and down her tree since she had moved had worn them to sharp edges. Miss Hickory now had skates or snowshoes, whichever she needed. She skimmed off on the icy crust of the snow as fleet as a deer, and suddenly as happy as a sharp snowy winter day can make one. Her objective was food. No longer could she depend upon her canning of a season ago, but she knew that frozen foods had become popular. Every berry bush and seed pod was her cafeteria. She skated first over the field known as high mowing. Black elderberries grew along the edge, tasty and crisp for a snack. Before she reached their winter shelter, she heard the clucking songs of content that came from the Ladies' Aid Society, which she had helped to found. Hen Pheasant was there, and huddled close beside her were a number of other drab little hens. There's a picture of Miss Hickory skating, by the way. The blanket of snow that covered the beautiful bed quilt or leaves that they had made only kept them warmer and the colors of the quilt brighter. They seemed happy enough, nesting together without Cock Pheasant and his lordly fellows. Miss Hickory caught scraps of talk. "Cock has to walk in his best coat tails in plain sight down the road and into the stubble to get his breakfast. Our food is right here." Hen Pheasant gave a gay peck at a kernel of corn. "They'll all come back to us later. It is a custom that we and our cock should nest separately in the winter. Plenty of corn and seeds for us right here." So the Ladies' Aid Society crooned and clucked. "They are all right. I won't disturb them," Miss Hickory thought as she bit a red elderberry, then skated across the road into the acre piece. First Brook ran along one side of Acre Piece. Wild roses grew on its banks. Now in December there were no leaves on the wild rose bushes, but the rose hips covered it with color. Round and painted by the frost, the hips of the wild roses looked like little oranges waiting for Miss Hickory to pick them. She did. She said, as she crunched the frozen goodness of the fruit and the seeds. Then Miss Hickory rested a while, looking down, listening to the tiny sound of the brook under its thin roof of ice. She wondered where the brook was going, for it never stood still as the frog pond did. Where did it come from? First Brook had another attraction for Miss Hickory. In summer, wild grapes grew on the vines along the banks. Young trees, tall ferns, and a tangle of sumac hid the dark purple clusters of the grapes, so that only wood creatures picked them when they ripened in the autumn. There were still many frozen grapes for Miss Hickory's desserts. She cut figure eights on the ice, ate grapes, skimmed on and on along First Brook with the current curling on beneath the ice. She went farther than she knew. All at once the bank looked oddly like old times. She left the ice, climbed the steep bank of First Brook, and there she was at the old place. She was just behind the barn. The hours had slipped by so pleasantly, skating, sliding, eating, that it was nearly supper time when Miss Hickory reached the barn. The days were short, and the sun was setting a ball of fire in the coldly green west. Miss Hickory remembered Mr. T. Willard Brown's warnings about wild heifer's appetite. She also remembered that she had missing cow take her medicine after eating too much. The barn, Miss Hickory knew, was a warm, friendly place, a shelter for hens and sheep, horses and pigeons, cow and her twin heifers, as well as for Mr. T. Willard Brown. I should have come over here when he invited me, she said to herself, utter pettishness that I didn't. Just then the barn door opened slightly to let in supper. Corn for the fowls, mash for the lambs, hay and oats were pulled down. Miss Hickory was of a mind to slip in through the door only to warm herself before going home, but she had just escaped a galloping heifer dashing in. A close call for you, Miss Hickory, Mr. T. Willard Brown purred into her ear. He had crept up silently, his eyes gleaming like little green traffic lights. Use my cat hole if you want to come inside. You are just in time to see something good, most unusual. The cat hole, small and square, had a hinged door close to the ground. Mr. T. Willard Brown bumped the door up with his nose, entered the barn, and Miss Hickory followed him. Inside, the hour of good eating filled the barn with content, but Miss Hickory stared in astonishment. The twin heifers were not having their supper in Cow's stall. Only one of the twins, Barn Heifer, stood quietly eating beside her mother. Mr. T. Willard Brown's eyes lighted the dusk as he led Miss Hickory toward the half-open door. There, eating side by side, stood Wild Heifer and Fawn. All day they had run together, Wild Heifer tasting freedom, Fawn sharing his forest secrets. They had grown tall since summer, but could still be taken for sister and brother. Wild Heifer's legs had learned a swiftness that no other heifer had known. Fawn's dappled coat was losing its spots in his thicker winter one. At first Fawn had feared the barn. He had waited at supper time at the wood side of the spinning where 4 white birch trees made an entrance to the acre piece with the afterglow of the sunset behind. But Wild Heifer had urged Fawn to follow her. At last, stepping on winged feet, hesitating with dilated nostrils and raised head, ready to retreat in great arched bounds, Fawn had come to the barn. The pail of good mash waited near the open door. I told you we have strange goings on here in the barn, Mr. T. Willard Brown said as he and Miss Hickory watched. Every night Wild Heifer shares her supper with Fawn. And that is the end of Chapter 8.